So it sounds like if you're like Dave, you must be a pretty great parent because I have one like that.
You're making me cry and feel better about myself all at the same time.
Well, that's the Vinyl Cafe.
That really is. From NCPR, welcome to Northwards. People, ideas, and conversations from and about Northern New York, Vermont, and beyond. I'm Mitch Teich.
Support for the Northwards podcast comes from the J.C. Steiniger and M.E. McDonald Charitable Fund at Adirondack Foundation in support of the Adirondack Foundation, building stronger Adirondack communities.
So I've been in radio for 33 and a third years. If I wanted to make an audio pun, I would say that is a record amount of time. Thank you. Anyway, there have been a lot of interesting things I've done in that time. Also some weird things and some kind of boring things, but almost all of them have had one thing in common, and that is storytelling. Most of us who are lucky enough to do a job like this, probably all of us in fact, owe a debt of gratitude to the storytellers that we've listened to over the years. I don't try consciously to sound like any of them, but their voices are in my head as I write a story or I record an interview conversation or even sketch out an introduction like this one. They're people who have taught me things about pacing or using the language honestly or when to make a horrible pun or when the audience will anticipate the next line without my even saying it. For a long time, the late Stuart McLean's voice has occupied some of the space for rent inside my head. McLean was a storyteller. I don't even think there's an adjective sufficient to describe him, but he was great. McLean wrote and hosted the Vinyl Cafe, which aired on the CBC and on some public radio stations like this one. At one level, it was a variety show, kind of like a Prairie Home Companion, with musical guests and conversation, but the centerpiece was McLean's fictional stories about a couple, the well-intentioned but often hapless Dave, his wife Morley, their kids, and their friends and neighbors who occupied a small town in Ontario. I had the great good fortune to speak with Stuart McLean in my previous job in Milwaukee, and I'd always hoped to speak with him again, but sadly, he passed away in 2017. But in just the last couple of years, his producer, Jess Milton, launched a podcast that revisits McLean's stories and also shares her unique experiences working with Stuart on the show. The podcast is as warm-hearted as the original Vinyl Cafe was, and so it is really a treat to be joined from the Ottawa area by Jess Milton. It's wonderful to talk with you.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. We have a very soft spot. I'm speaking collectively because I know I can speak for Stuart when I say we. He and I have and had a very soft spot in our hearts for North Country Public Radio. So thank you so much for having me.
That is so sweet of you to say. Yeah, obviously we aired the Vinyl Cafe for years, sadly years before I came here. But let me just ask you a really, maybe it's a dumb question. How does one become the Vinyl Cafe's or really Stuart McLean's producer?
Well, if Stuart were here, he would be so happy that you asked this question because it's a good story and it's the kind of story we tell on the podcast because it's a backstory. So I didn't start as the producer. I started part-time on the radio show and Stuart was a teacher. He taught journalism at what we now call Metropolitan University, and I had Stuart as a teacher. And this was, I guess, 2003, and he and the founding producer of the show, David Amer, were looking for someone to help out. I like to joke that I owe basically my entire career to one single overflowing email inbox because both Stuart and David were older, and email was a relatively new thing. And the show it wasn't in 2003 where it would end up, but it was starting to. And so they were getting all this email and they were kind of like, they needed help. They were like, what do we do? How often do we reply? Is it like mail? Like it was really. And so Stuart said to David, well, why don't I ask one of my students if we can hire them just part-time, maybe 3 days a week, 6 hours a day, something like that. And I was not his first choice. And this is the part that he loved telling this story. I was not at all his first choice. His first choice and maybe even his second choice turned him down. I think there were 12 students in the class, so he was like working his way through the list until he got to me, the bottom of the barrel. So I had him as a teacher, and he offered me the job, and it really, quite honestly, was not a very appealing job. It was, like I said, 3 days a week, 6 hours a day, and I was answering email and answering listener mail, and I had quite an interest. I had a lot of good options after university. I was interning on the National, our big CBC's big nightly news program, and I worked as an assistant director at a sports television station, which I'd done all the way through university to put myself through school. So I had some cool options on the table, and my family and my friends couldn't understand why I was going to take this like entry level position, but I took it because those other jobs were they were well trodden paths, like they were what I always imagined myself doing. I wanted to be a foreign correspondent, and I knew exactly how to do that. You went to J school, you worked on the National or a big show like that, then you went out to the regions, and that's what I thought I would always do. And then this came along, and I thought, well, this is kind of weird and quirky and neat. I just really liked Stuart, and I really liked David, and I liked the way they worked, which quite frankly didn't feel very much like work at all. They just sort of hung out and came up with story ideas. And so I took the job, and I did that for, I guess, a couple of years. And I went on full time, and then David Amer retired, and I was not at all ready to become producer of the show. I was too green. I was too young, but there was nobody else. and so I took over, and it was a very steep learning curve for a couple of years. But what was cool about that is he taught me how to be the type of producer that he needed. And so we just worked extremely well together. And by that point, we'd already been working together for a couple of years, and we're really close. So we knew we'd be able to do it together.
Well, and you talk about this not being the well-trodden path, and really I can't imagine that there is any other job quite like producer at the Vinyl Cafe.
I'm sort of looking for, I was about to say I'm looking for a job right now. I don't know if that's quite true, but I guess I sort of am. And when I go to write a resume, I'm like, what? Like, no, who would ever hire me? I have tons of skills, but they're so bizarre, Actually, I like to joke. I have two little kids. I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old. And my job was very applicable on the job training for being a mother of young children, because it's like really fun and really engaging, and you love it so much, but it's also like incredibly chaotic and totally overwhelming and all consuming and 24 hours a day. You're like late nights and early mornings, and now I have petulant children instead of musicians and storytellers, but it's similar kind of thing.
Nice of you not to call the musicians petulant, though.
Yeah. Well, they're probably listening. I would happily call Stuart and I used to joke. He for a while he had one of the ways he would like to shine the light on Meg Masters, his story editor, as he would call her, his long suffering. And he tried to, it was just a way to share the spotlight with Meg and kind of give her some attention, because she did so much on our show. And for a while, he called me the irascible Jess Milton, because we had this kind of like, we were so close and we spent so much time together. We had this sort of funny relationship where we loved each other so much, but we also, almost like a sibling relationship or like a parent-child relationship or something. And so, yeah, we would like go at each other all the time. And all the people who toured with us all the time, they were used to it, but someone new would come onto the bus and they'd be like, what's going on with those two? And everyone would be like, oh yeah. So anyway, yeah, I would happily call Stuart petulant, but not anybody else, because if he were here, he would laugh and call me irascible. That would be that.
Well, and so to listen to the stories that you tell on the podcast, sometimes it sounds like a very, like, putting the show together each week sounds like a very specialized, bizarre version of The Amazing Race. Stuart looking for just the right story to tell.
I'm sorry. That is one of the best descriptions I've ever heard, and I am going to steal that. It is perfect.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, but for people who haven't heard the podcast and who don't know like what it took to bring that show together week in and week out, in a nutshell, can you describe what I hesitate to use the word lunacy, but like what chaos it was to put that show together each week?
Well, I don't even know why that was. Like, maybe I was just really bad at my job, but I think we were doing a lot. So Stuart, the first thing you need to know is Stuart and I were the only two people who worked full time on the show. So we had this really tight bond, and we really do or did. See, I still use the present. Um, we saw the world in the same way and really trusted each other. So that was fantastic. But it was a bit of a, yeah, the two of us were kind of joined at the hip in a way. And so I think the reason it was chaotic is that we were doing a lot. So I was away from home. Stuart lived in Toronto, and I live near you guys. I live just outside of Ottawa on the Quebec side in a little town called Chelsea, Quebec. So I was away about 150 days a year, sometimes 200 days a year, and Stuart and I would be on tour about 100 days of the year. So much of our producing was done remotely back in the day when remote work was like, like I remember going in, it was just not a thing. Like back then, the way most people put together a weekly radio show was they would sit in studio, and we still produced. Like when I first started, I'm really dating myself here, but when I first started, we were still cutting tape with razor blades. And then that wasn't, I never produced shows like that. David Amer did, but I never did. But in my early days, that's what we were doing. And then, but my first sort of 5 years on the show, you weren't like sending files digitally. You were burning them onto a CD and walking the CD down to master control and stuff. So there was like some logistical things, but then also we lived on a tour bus. There would be about 12 or 13 of us out on the road for 3, 4, 5, even 6 weeks. And we had bunk beds on the bus, and we would travel from location to location, and we would record some of those shows for the radio. It kind of felt like a family vacation, which of course, as everyone listening will know, is both the best of times and the craziest of times. So yeah, it was bizarre. And then also Stuart he was a character. He lost his glasses about 150 times a day, and he he saw the world in such an amazing and unique way. But my eldest daughter is like this. She has a real gift. She sees the world differently and moves through the world a little bit differently, which is both her greatest attribute and I think probably going to be her biggest challenge too, right? Because the world isn't always set up for people who see it through a prism that looks a little bit different. And so I loved that about Stuart. Like I have pictures of him sitting on benches that say "do not sit here," not because he was being petulant, but because he just didn't even notice that sign, and they didn't, so yeah, it just led to a lot of kind of funny situations, which of course we mined and fictionalized for the show all the time as well.
Well, right. I mean, I think the thing that maybe surprised me most, both in talking to him about how the show came together and now listening to you talk about it, both on the podcast and as we're having this conversation, is the idea that it sounds like you would roll into town, and then the process of deciding what the story would start, and it's incredible to think that such brilliance could be done at the drop of a hat. That like the muse was on retainer.
Wow, I love the way you think about these things. Yeah, so I think that good for you for recognizing that. That was probably. It's funny, like I didn't realize in the moment how unique that was, but now with the distance from the show and just with age and experience, I realize how unique our style of producing was. So to give people listening a sense, what would happen is, well, all right. So we would think we would know what we were going to write about. So Louise Curtis was our production assistant. I still work with Louise. She's one of the producers of the podcast. So Louise or I, in the early days, it was just me. And then thank goodness Louise came in because she was much better at it than me. But we would do these elaborate research packages ahead of time. So say we were going to Ogdensburg. We would often start reading the local newspaper ahead of time. We'd go on, Facebook groups. We'd start interviewing people, and we'd start processing information about that place to try to uncover what the stories might be. So I would maybe say to Louise, like, hey, Louise, we're going to Ogdensburg, and I think we should write about Canadians that come across the border and have PO boxes down in Ogdensburg. So, she'd call up these places and she'd interview some people. She'd maybe find some Canadians who have some. She'd talk to border agents. We'd put together a research package, and Stuart and I had a neat little tradition where we wouldn't read it until we were on the train or plane or in the car, or however we were getting to this place. We'd take our binders out with our highlighters, and we would independently review these 40, 50 page research packages. And then when we'd land in the town, I'd usually book us like like a little cottage or an apartment with 2 rooms or 2 hotel rooms connected or something like that. So we had some private space and then also some space together, and we'd kind of get all set up, and then we'd gather and we'd look at our notes, and almost always he and I were interested in the same thing. So we'd be like, all right, that's our story. Like, this is the part that interests us, and then we'd hit the ground running. And so we'd get up that first morning and he would go one way and I would go the other way. And I'm telling you, 95% of the time, the story ended up being something completely different than what we thought it was going to be, because we would just try our best to sort of embed ourselves in the community. My favorite place to go would be, I'd sit in coffee shops and I would eavesdrop. It sounds horrible, but like, don't ever sit next to me in a restaurant. I can't help myself. Like, I'm listening to every conversation going on. You do start to get a sense of what people care about. And if you hear all those conversations for a few days, you also sort of start to get a sense of the personality of a place. And he would get that sense too. And again, like most of the time, we would hear similar stories, right? Our ears heard certain frequencies and our ears heard the same frequencies usually. So we'd kind of get a sense of a place. And we'd be there we might be in town for 5 or 6 days. So we'd be researching and kind of living there and just experiencing it for the first 3 or 4. Stuart was a real deadline hound. So if it were up to him, he'd be writing, like the show is 7:30, he'd be writing till 7:29, which drove me absolutely crazy. But yeah, like we'd try, we'd spend the last day right before the show, or as I said, even the morning of, we'd be working on the script and he'd be writing it. And so, it kind of came together in a pretty funny way, but I miss that. That's probably I miss traveling on tour too, but those recording shows where we really got a feeling of a place and tried to tell a story that gave a sense of what a place was like and who the people were and just captured that moment in time. I loved doing that.
It's interesting. I mean, you, in the end, really did become a journalist.
Yeah. It's so funny. I work with, so I have a day job a couple of days a week that I work with a journalist that I admired and looked up to when I was in journalism school. I actually wrote my paper in my last year on him as a journalist. And we were somewhere recently and he referred to me as a journalist. And I was like, what? Like, that's so weird how you referred to me as a journalist. And he said, well, you are a journalist. Like, that's what you did for all of those years. And I had never thought of it like that. And you're only the second person to ever say those words to me. And it makes me feel good. Thank you. That's I guess it is what we were trying to do. We just came about it in a different way,
Yeah. I mean, it's, and I know there can't really be different grades of uniqueness, but it's unique to think about coming in and doing a show that is fiction, but is so informed by the same kind of journalistic principles that a lot of us have tried to aspire to.
I think the reason Stuart's fictional stories often resonated as well as they did and why they felt so true is because he researched them the way he did when he researched journalistic stories, and he was always gathering scraps of like little tiny pieces of, like, not literally, although also literally, little scraps of paper with, little bits, like, and I learned that from him, like just the other day, somebody said something to me. It was just a small little thing. It was another parent who said something, at like school pickup. And I just filed it away as like, ooh, that's a good little nugget to put in. So I don't have any fictional stories. I don't write fiction myself. And so I don't have anywhere to use those little nuggets anymore. But he and I would, especially, and he was so good at it, we'd collect these little nuggets in our journeys and our travels. And we met so many people. We met thousands of people a year, right? So you had lots of inspiration and lots of sources. And and he would just collect them, and you never knew where they were gonna show up.
You say you don't write fiction, but I guess when you are putting together the stories that bookend the podcast, are you using things that you learned, storytelling that you learned from Stuart all those years in putting those kinds, even the true stories together?
Absolutely. I mean, I think Stuart, everything I know, I learned from him. Everything I know about storytelling and I think I knew, we worked together for so long, I think I knew how much I'd learned from him about storytelling and sort of narrative structure and style and that kind of thing. But what surprised me is when we started, so I didn't want to host this podcast, right? Like all I wanted was to get his stories out there. It kind of came from the collective hangover that I think we have from COVID. So I had a couple of very difficult years, as I know a lot of people did at the tail end of COVID for a whole bunch of reasons. And I just was feeling like I missed creating something good, for lack of a better term. Like I missed kindness and laughter and collective experience and yeah, the laughter of recognition and all those things. And there were, I had pitched to CBC Radio that they should play some of the stories, and they kind of took me up on it, and I had to go back into the archives is my point. And as every time I went to listen to stories to find out which ones were going to feel right for a certain moment, I just felt so good listening to them. And so all I wanted when I created this podcast, I thought maybe other people will feel the same way as me. Maybe, they'll feel good listening to them. And so I came up with this idea to start the podcast, and all I was going to do is put two stories together, and then you have to have someone to introduce them. So I was just going to come on and be like, hey, here's two stories about, I don't know, rats. Like, because believe it or not, there actually are two stories about rats. But anyway, but when I sat down to do it, I went out to the garage. We have a little space out there, basically to escape our own children. And I went out there one weekend. I was trying to write in the house, and he's like, you can't do this. Like, this is crazy. This is back in those times when everyone was home all the time. So I went out to the garage, and it was so interesting. Like I started putting it together, and I was out there for 8 or 9 hours, and I just couldn't stop writing, like, because all the memories were coming back. And so, I wrote some stuff and I sent it to Louise. I mentioned to her earlier and said, like, I don't know, like, I don't know what this is like, but here's a few things. And she was like, Jess, I think this is really good. And so my point is, when I sat down in studio, I have been on the radio many, many times doing media interviews and on stage with Stuart and I together in studio and stuff like that. But the part that surprised me was how much I just learned through osmosis about hosting, about how to read a story. Stuart had this incredible ability to embody his own work. Like he really, I used the word ability there, but that wasn't right. It always came from his heart. So he didn't have to try to do it. And that's what I learned from him, I think, is these things just flow through me. They're not coming from my head. They're coming from my heart. And so it's easy to write them. It's easy to tell those stories, and it's easy to host the show because it just feels like I'm talking to friends. And I think I kind of am, like most of the people who listen to the podcast are longtime listeners, and I recognize their names and stuff like that. So yeah, it's just kind of like having a bunch of friends over.
I mean, there's an obvious difference between the stories that Stuart told and the ones you're telling through the podcast. His stories were always intended for an audience, while you're kind of peeling back the curtain on things that generally happen without anybody else watching. Do you have like two different files in your mind, the ones that you're willing to share and the ones that will never see the light of day?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my general rule is I never ever say anything that I wouldn't be comfortable saying in front of Stuart. So I don't have to think about that often, though, because Stuart and I had a relationship where we shared everything with each other. And also he was really open, and he was really himself, as am I. And so there are very few stories that he wouldn't feel comfortable with me telling. Even the ones like we had this joke, and I've made the joke on the podcast several times, that Stuart was a bit of a hypochondriac. And of course, Dave, the fictional character Dave, is a total hypochondriac. And Stuart didn't believe he was a hypochondriac, but he was, like, not to the extent that Dave is. But I mean, I teased him about that all the time. And I teased him about that on our show, like on the Vinyl Cafe. So those are stories where if he were around, he'd be rolling his eyes and saying like, oh, come on, Jess. But I don't feel bad saying it because, we produced lots of shows together where I teased him about that, and they aired on the radio and stuff. So that's the filter that I put it through before I record it. I'm like, is there anything in here that I wouldn't feel comfortable saying in front of Stuart? And so a couple of times, like there's been a couple times where I've thought, okay, that's how I remember that. Is that how he would remember it? And I would maybe temper it a little bit. But he was, well, you met him, like he was very, I was about to say he was the same person on stage as he was off. That's not true, because he was quite shy. And we had this joke that sometimes after a show, people would win tickets backstage or something, and he would he was an introvert, and I'm totally an extrovert. And so his stories were very from the heart and very much him, and he was very open, but he was not outgoing. So like in a room, he'd be the guy that would blend into the wallpaper, right? And so he would sometimes look at me before an event where he was supposed to be Stuart McLean, and he would look at me and say, like, I need you to be Stuart McLean tonight. And that was often my role in his life, was to be the effervescent one, and it was another one of many reasons why we worked so well together, because he's an observer. Like, he was, I told you about the little scraps, the little pieces of paper, the little nuggets that he was always collecting. You can't do that and be the life of the party, right? You have to be the one watching. You have to be the one with your back against the wall and a notebook in your hand. That was him. And I was the one pouring the champagne. So it was a good combo.
It's so interesting to hear you describe it in those terms, because I mean, I feel, having done any number of things on stage, much more comfortable like with a microphone in front of me than if I'm in a situation where when you have the microphone in front of you, and I don't know if this was Stuart, but like, what the rules are. There's something that's expected of you, and you have control over what you do with it. And if you're at a party, who knows what's going to happen? And it's interesting. People don't always appreciate that you can be a performer without being an extrovert.
We worked with a lot of performers over the years, and I would say most of them are introverts. Like, I was really into theater and stuff as a kid, but now when I think back to what I was like as a kid, I was the crazy one, right? Like, I always had confidence and was out there. Most performers I know are not like that, because they are the one in the middle of it, at the parties, at the whatever. It's really often the people, I don't know what it is, but I think you're absolutely right. I'd never heard it phrased the way you said about, what your role is when you're in front of a microphone. Or maybe there's like is it a fantasy that you're playing out where you are able to do that, where you can't do that in day-to-day life? Or is there something about the anonymity, about that fourth wall that is protection? I don't know, but and what's so interesting to me is people who are outgoing and very good in social situations often fall apart on stage, right? Like, I don't know that I could do what Stuart could do, even though I have no problem holding forth at a dinner party. But could I go out on stage and be vulnerable like that in front of 3,000 people? I don't know. So I find it really interesting, and you're not alone, and neither was he. Most performers I know are introverts.
So when I had the good fortune to get to chat with Stuart more than a decade ago, he talked about another conversation he once had when someone asked him, if I told you Dave was in the next room, would you want to meet him? And Stuart talked about how terrified he was of that thought.
A guy was once interviewing me and asked if he told me that Dave was in the next room, would I want to go and meet him? Which was a question that floored me, because he was my imaginary friend. This is a guy I've written about for almost 20 years. And I was pulled up completely short, because one would think that, of course, you'd want to meet him. And I was horrified with the idea, because I was afraid it would be horribly awkward, that I would walk in, and what if I didn't like him? What if there was something about him I had missed completely?
But the upshot was he was afraid, like, what would happen if he didn't like Dave? Would you want to meet Dave if he were in the next room?
Absolutely. But it's different for me than it is for Stuart, because I didn't write the Dave Morley stories. And because so I think Stuart didn't want to meet Dave. I remember that interview so well, and that question. And Stuart and I talked about it endlessly afterwards. And I know exactly why he wouldn't want to meet Dave. He wouldn't want to meet him because Stuart never really wanted to know where the stories came from. Like, it was amazing watching him work. Like, they really did just flow through him. And he wasn't systematic in his writing. Like, they just kind of came through him organically, and he didn't understand where they came from. And I think he worried that if he understood, they'd stop coming to him. And I don't have that relationship, right? Like, that I worked on the stories, but I didn't write them. They didn't appear in my head or my tummy or wherever they appeared for Stuart. And so I would want to meet Dave because I'd want to mine him for material, I'd want to be like, hey man, like, what's going on? What about this? And what about that? Yeah, I absolutely would. But more importantly, I'd like to meet Morley, because I think, and Stephanie, I think they're the characters that now, today, I'm the most interested in, for two reasons. Obviously, I'm a woman, and so I'm interested in them. But I think, especially Stephanie, I think we failed her a little bit. I think I failed her a little bit. Stuart obviously he didn't have daughters. He was never a woman, and so he had never been a young woman. And I think he needed my perspective, and I don't think I ever was able to give her what she deserved, like give Stuart what he deserved to give her. And I feel like I regret that. And I feel like I failed her. And so I'd like to meet her so I could get to know her better and understand her better, and hear what stories she'd like to tell about herself. And Morley too. And I love Morley as a mom. Like, this is so crazy, but I love her. So many of the reactions, I used to say this to her. I didn't have kids back then, but I used to say to him, like, wow, where did that come from? Like, one of my favorite scenes is it's a throwaway little line. It's not central to the story, but it's in Morley's 40th birthday bash. And Sam is at this party, this neighborhood party, and he tries smoking for the first time. And he goes to his mom and he fesses up. He's like, I tried smoking. And she says, do you think you can quit? Which I just think is like she's telling him it's wrong, right? And she's telling him it's not a good idea, but she's not scolding him. She doesn't go to I'm getting choked up talking about it. She doesn't go to a place of shame. It's funny, but it also like enables him to be the one in charge of making the right decision. God, I wish I could react like that when my kids do something boneheaded, But if Stuart were here, he would tell you that he was in the moment with his own, he may not have been able to have that kind of reaction in the moment, but he was on the page, right? So, yeah, I'd like to meet Morley too, just because I think I'd like her.
The frightening thing for me is as I was getting ready for this interview, I was thinking about Dave, and I have two kids, a daughter who is 20 or almost 20, and a son who is almost 16, and I may have learned much of my parenting style from Dave.
Well, Dave existed before Stuart and I knew each other, so I can't. What I'm about to say should be taken with a grain of salt. But in the later years, my father is very Dave-esque, and so and a lot of the, in the good ways and the bad ways. Like my dad is, and maybe you're like this if you took some of your parenting. But the best thing about my dad is how much I know he loves me. Like his love, I'm gonna cry. Like his love for me is, he says it all the time, but he doesn't have to. He shows it, and Dave is so good at that. But my dad also does insane things, right? So he's kind of, he makes some questionable decisions too, and absolutely ridiculous ones, like Dave. But like Dave, they always come from a good place, so it's easy to forgive him and easy to root for him. So it sounds like if you're like Dave, you must be a pretty great parent, because I have one like that.
You're making me cry and feel better about myself all at the same time.
Well, that's the Vinyl Cafe.
That really is. It's probably no surprise that you've talked about Stuart in the present tense many times through this, considering how long your relationship with him was and how long the two of you worked on this show together. And so I guess I owe it to myself to ask the question I was going to ask, but if it's too personal, tell me so. Do you still have Stuart's number in your phone?
Yes, I do. I have his number in my phone. I have the last voicemail that he left for me. I have, no, I can't imagine. That's a great question. I can't imagine not having his number in my phone. And it's actually, his number is one of very few that I still know off by heart, because when I first started working with him, cell phones existed, but you didn't have them programmed in that same way where you don't. So I still know his number off by heart. I should call it. That's a great idea. I should call it on the podcast one. Like I should call that phone number and record that and do an episode of the podcast where, so here's a funny story, completely unrelated to the Vinyl Cafe, but my stepdad, he lives far away, and my mom died when I was in my 20s, and I called Joe my stepdad, but I think they got married a year before my mom died, and I was grown up, so he was not ever my father, but I love him very dearly. And I had not seen him since COVID, but I'd been keeping in touch with him and sending pictures of my kids to him and stuff. And at some point he stopped replying, and he's not young. And so I started getting he doesn't reply a few times. That's fine. But months pass and I don't hear it. And I'm starting to think I have his home address. Do I send the cops over there? I'm reaching out to friends of his. Anyway, finally, I get this text back, and the text says, "Your kids are really cute, but I'm not Joe." But and he's fine, but he'd gotten a new cell phone and a new cell phone number and had never told me. And for like 6 months, I'd been sending pictures of my family to this woman. Well, she and I still keep in touch. Like this whole thing happened because I was like, I'm sorry, I haven't heard back from her. She offered to go to his apartment and do like a wellness check and everything. Anyway, turns out Joe's completely fine. He just forgot to send me his phone number. But it did get me thinking, like it takes, so she had not had the phone for a long time, and she'd only gotten like 3 weeks worth of my texts and photos, not
thank heavens, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, what was I right away? I was like, uh-oh. But it did get me thinking, like, there's something there, right? Like our phones are our lifelines, but are they a lifeline to someone that we don't even know? So the idea of calling Stuart's phone number and seeing who has it now that would be fun.
And of course, that story you just told would have been a perfect Dave story.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I thought, so this happens to me all the time. I told you about these little scraps, and I have all these little scraps of stories and nowhere to put them anymore. But that's a perfect example. Like when that happened, I thought, if I got that text back from that woman, if Stuart were still alive, I'd immediately call him, and we'd start like playing around with what we could do with that idea. And so many of the stories started like that, a little offhanded comment or a little moment, and then I'd call Stuart up and we'd be like, "Oh my God, yeah, yes, right." And you start. And you may end up somewhere completely different, but it starts with a little something that happened in real life.
Well, Jess Milton, I feel like I have to say this. Any number of the Vinyl Cafe stories that were still on my computer or still on my phone were really one of the things that got me through the depths of COVID. And so I'm really grateful to you and Stuart. And I'm especially grateful that we had this conversation and this chance to talk.
Well, thank you so much. You got me laughing, and you got me crying, and you got me thinking. So I'm very, very happy to be here, and just happy to be reminded. Like we spent a lot of time in your neck of the woods over the years, and you brought back so many nice memories. So thank you as well.
The irascible Jess Milton was the longtime producer of The Vinyl Cafe, which originated on the CBC but also aired on many public radio stations, including NCPR. Today, she is producer and host of the podcast Backstage at The Vinyl Cafe. She lives just outside Ottawa, and you'll find a link to Backstage at The Vinyl Cafe from ncpr.org/northwards. And now we will go backstage on Northwards and hear from our producer, Ethan Shanty.
Northwards is an NCPR podcast production. The show is written, edited, and produced by Mitch Tyke with digital production supervision by me, Ethan Shanty. Caitlin Kelly handles our social media, Bill Hanel is our digital director, and Doyle Dean is our production manager. Music is by the Wickmore Jazz Trio of Plattsburgh. To support this show and find more podcasts, visit ncpr.org. This is NCPR, North Country Public Radio.